The sign at the entrance of Oak Creek still claimed the population was 4,200, though the rusted hinges and the faded paint suggested the town had been shrinking long before Mark Sokol decided to return. Mark gripped the steering wheel of his withered sedan, his knuckles white. He had left this place 10 years ago with a law degree in his sights and the dust of the valley on his heels. He never intended to come back. But life, or rather the slow decay of his father's health, had a way of pulling one back into the gravity of the past. His father's house smelled of menthol, antiseptic, and the sour tang of unwashed laundry. Elias Sokol, once the town's most formidable carpenter, was now a shadow draped in wool blankets, his lungs failing him after 40 years of inhaling sawdust and cheap tobacco. Mark spent the first week cleaning, organizing prescriptions, and enduring the suffocating silence of a house that felt like a mausoleum. The call came on a Tuesday. It was Mrs. Gable, the court clerk who had known Mark since he was in diapers. "Mark, honey, I know you're only here for your dad, but Judge Whittaker is in a bind. We've got a petty theft case, a migrant worker from the Miller farm. No one wants to take it. It's a pro bono mess, but the boy needs a warm body in the room." Mark wanted to say no. He wanted to sit on the porch and watch the fog roll over the fields until his father's time was up. But the stagnation of the town was already itching at his skin. He needed a distraction. The thief was a young man named Tomas, barely 20, with eyes that darted around the cramped consultation room like a trapped bird. He was accused of stealing a high-capacity irrigation pump from the Miller farm, the largest employer in the county. "I didn't take it," Tomas whispered in broken English, his hands trembling. "I was trying to fix it. It broke. And they said I broke it to steal the parts. But the pump, it was already old. It was garbage." "Why would you steal garbage, Tomas?" Mark asked, leaning back. "I wouldn't. But I saw things, Mr. Lawyer, in the North Acreage. They don't want me there. The theft, it is a reason to put me in jail or send me away." Mark looked at the police report. It was signed by Sheriff Vance, a man Mark remembered as a high school bully who had simply traded a varsity jacket for a badge. The report was sloppy, thin on evidence, but thick with accusations. In a town like Oak Creek, the word of a miller was law, and the word of a migrant was wind. Mark felt a familiar, dangerous spark of indignation. He didn't realize that by shaking Tomas's hand, he was pulling a thread that would unravel the entire fabric of the quiet haven. The Miller farm was not a farm in the traditional sense. It was an industrial empire of corn and soy that stretched to the horizon. As Mark drove through the main gates the following morning, he was struck by the eerie perfection of it. The fences were freshly painted, the machinery was state-of-the-art, and the silos rose like silver cathedrals against the gray sky. He was met at the perimeter by Sheriff Vance. The sheriff's cruiser was parked sideways, blocking the path to the North Acreage Tomas had mentioned. Vance leaned against the hood, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Lost, Sokol?" Vance asked, his grin not reaching his eyes. "The courthouse is 10 miles back that way. This is private property. I'm here to inspect the site of the alleged theft, Bill," Mark said, stepping out of the car. He kept his voice level, professional. "Discovery phase. I have the right to see where my client was apprehended." Vance laughed, a dry, grating sound. "Your client is a drifter who got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Mayor Miller is doing this town a favor by providing jobs, and you come back home just to spit in his eye. Your daddy wouldn't be proud of that, Mark." Elias always knew which side his bread was buttered on. "My father is dying, Bill. He doesn't have much to say about pride these days. Now, move the car, or I'll call Judge Whittaker and report a violation of the discovery process before lunch." Vance's expression soured, but he moved. As Mark drove past, he noticed a group of workers in the distance. They weren't wearing the standard bright safety gear of the Miller employees. They were dressed in rags, moving with a synchronized, mechanical desperation. They disappeared behind a row of trailers as soon as his car approached. Mark didn't go to the pump station first. He took a detour toward the northern boundary, where the land dipped into a valley hidden from the main road. There, he saw them, rows of shipping containers converted into makeshift housing. There was no plumbing, no electricity, only the stench of open waste and the sight of a heavy, padlocked gate. He took out his phone to snap a photo, but a black SUV suddenly roared up the dirt path, kicking up a cloud of choking dust. Out stepped Julian Miller, the mayor's younger brother and the farm's manager. He didn't look like a farmer. He looked like a man who spent his time in air-conditioned offices and expensive gyms. "Mr. Sokol," Julian said, his voice smooth as oil, "I think you've wandered off the path. The pump station is 3 miles south. This area is under quarantine for soil contaminants. Very dangerous for a city boy like you." The threat was thinly veiled. As Julian spoke, Mark noticed to other men in the SUV. They weren't farm hands. They had the cold, vacant stares of hired muscle. Mark realized then that Tomas wasn't lying. This wasn't about a stolen pump. It was about what happened in the shadows of the Green Acres, a secret the town had agreed to keep in exchange for its survival. The humidity in the Oak Creek County archives was thick enough to choke the ancient industrial dehumidifier humming in the corner. Mark sat at a cramped metal desk, surrounded by stacks of property tax records and land use permits that smelled of damp basement and slow decay. He wasn't looking for the pump anymore. He was looking for the money. If Julian Miller was right about soil contaminants, there should have been a paper trail: environmental impact reports, state-funded cleanup grants, and safety inspections. But the more Mark dug, the more he found a gaping void where the bureaucracy should have been. Instead of cleanup reports, he found a dizzying array of green restoration subsidies. Over the last 5 years, the Miller farm had received over $12 million in state and federal grants intended to promote sustainable farming and the integration of seasonal labor. Looking for something specific, or just enjoying the dust, Mark looked up to see Sarah Jenkins, a woman he had once shared a locker with in high school. Now, she was the county registrar, her eyes tired and her hair pulled back into a severe bun. She looked like someone who had spent a decade holding her breath. "I'm looking for the inspection logs for the Miller Farm's northern acreage, Sarah," Mark said, leaning back. "The state says they paid for a massive irrigation overhaul and a migrant housing complex that meets top-tier standards, but all I saw out there were rusted shipping containers and a sheriff who plays bodyguard for the mayor's brother." Sarah's face went pale. She glanced toward the open door, her hand instinctively touching the collar of her blouse. "Mark, don't. You've been gone a long time. You don't understand how things work here now. When the textile mill closed 10 years ago, this town was a month away from becoming a ghost town. The Millers kept the lights on. They paid for the new playground, the library wing, and the sheriff's department's new fleet of SUVs. And what did it cost the town?" Mark asked quietly. "Their souls. Or us their eyes so they could look the other way. It cost us our pride," she whispered. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a plain manila folder, sliding it across the desk with a hand that shook. "This isn't an official record. It's a log of the trucks that enter and leave that farm at 3 a.m. They don't carry corn, Mark. And they don't carry machinery." Mark opened the folder. It was a handwritten list of license plates and dates. Many of the plates were from out of state, some even from across the border. He felt a cold chill settle in his chest. This wasn't just a local scam. It was a pipeline. As he walked to his car that evening, the sun setting in a bruised purple hue over the valley, he found his first message. The driver's side window of his sedan had been smashed. On the driver's seat sat a single, heavy ear of corn, its husk stripped back to reveal kernels that had been painted a blood red. There was no note. In Oak Creek, the silence spoke louder than words. Mark spent the evening picking glass shards out of the upholstery of his car, the physical labor providing a brief respite from the mounting dread. When he finally went inside, he found his father sitting in the dark, the rhythmic wheeze of the oxygen concentrator the only sound in the living room. "You should leave it alone, Mark," Elias said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't turn to look at his son. "I can't, Dad. They're hurting people. They've turned that farm into a labor camp, and they're stealing millions from the state to fund it. The whole town is in on it. The whole town is eating because of it. Elias barked, followed by a violent fit of coughing that shook his frail frame. Mark rushed to his side, but the old man pushed him away. Before the millers expanded, people were losing their houses. Suicide rates were up. Opioids were everywhere. Now, people have jobs. There's a future here, even if it's a dirty one. You think you're a hero. You're just a man who forgot what it's like to be hungry. Mark looked at his father, the man who had taught him about justice and the sanctity of the law, and saw the crushing weight of pragmatism that comes with poverty. It was a betrayal deeper than any physical threat Julian Miller could offer. The next morning, the social pressure began in earnest. When Mark went to the local diner for coffee, the chatter died the moment he stepped inside. The waitress, a woman who had known his mother, served him without a word, refusing to meet his eyes. When he went to the hardware store to buy a tarp for his broken window, the owner told him they were out of stock, while a pile of tarps sat clearly visible behind the counter. It was a soft exile. No one was hitting him, but they were erasing him. He drove to the county jail to visit Tomas. The young man looked worse than before. His left eye was swollen shut, and he sat with a gingerly hunch that suggested broken ribs. What happened, Tomas? Mark hissed, gripping the bars of the visitation stall. I fell, Tomas said, his voice devoid of hope. The guards. They say I am clumsy. Mr. Lawyer, please, tell them I will confess. I will say I stole the pump. I will say I stole the moon if they just let me go back home. If you confess, you'll be deported or worse. Tomas, we have to fight this. I found the records. I know about the green recovery money. Tomas's eyes widened with genuine terror. You don't understand. It is not just the Millers. It is the system. They have people in the city. They have people in the capital. If you keep looking, they won't kill you. They will kill your father. They told me they know which house has the oxygen tanks. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a game of legal chess anymore. It was a siege. He left the jail with his heart hammering against his ribs, realizing that the quiet haven was actually a cage and the bars were made of the very people he had grown up with. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Sheriff Vance's cruiser pulled in behind him, tailing him at a precise, menacing distance. The drive to the state capitol took 3 hours, but under the torrential rain that had begun to lash the valley, it felt like an odyssey through a gray, watery purgatory. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror every 30 seconds. Sheriff Vance hadn't followed him past the county line, but the sensation of being watched didn't dissipate with the distance. He was heading to see David Sterling, an old law school friend who now worked as a senior aide in the state attorney general's office. David was a climber, ambitious, well-connected, and, Mark hoped, still possessed of a moral compass. They met in a sterile, glass-walled coffee shop in the shadow of the Capitol building. David looked polished in a tailored suit that cost more than Mark's first 3 cars. He listened in silence as Mark laid out the evidence: the falsified green restoration logs, the converted shipping containers, the systemic intimidation of migrant workers, and the complicity of the Oak Creek Police Department. It's a RICO case. David, Mark said, leaning over the table, his voice low and urgent. Human trafficking, embezzlement of state funds, and racketeering. The Millers have turned the whole county into a private fiefdom. David took a slow sip of his espresso, his expression unreadable. He looked at the copies of the ledger Sarah Jenkins had provided. Then, he sighed and slid the folder back toward Mark. Mark, do you have any idea how many green recovery grants are issued annually? Hundreds. The Millers are major donors to the governor's re-election campaign. They aren't just farmers. They are the economic heartbeat of that entire district. If we open an investigation based on a few handwritten logs and the testimony of a clumsy migrant worker, we aren't just attacking a farm, we're attacking a political foundation. So, you're saying they're too big to prosecute? Mark's voice rose, drawing looks from the nearby tables. I'm saying you need more than a smoking gun. You need a burning building, David replied, his eyes narrowing. And you need to be careful. The state auditor, who signed off on those Miller grants, He's the mayor's brother-in-law. The system isn't broken. Mark, it's working exactly as it was designed. If you push this without irrefutable physical evidence video, bank statements, a high-ranking whistleblower, you won't just lose the case. You'll lose your license. Or worse. Mark left the capital feeling a hollow coldness in his gut. The quiet haven wasn't an isolated island of corruption. It was a node in a much larger, much darker network. As he drove back toward Oak Creek, his phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. Mr. Sokol, a woman's voice whispered through a thick layer of static. I saw what happened to Tomas. I am at the North Trailers. They are moving us tonight. They say there is a health inspection tomorrow, so they are taking us to the old quarry. If you want the truth, come tonight. Before the trucks arrive, the line went dead. Mark knew it could be a trap. In fact, it almost certainly was. But as he crossed the county line back into the darkness of the valley, he realized he was already dead in the eyes of this town. The only way out was through the fire. The old limestone quarry was a jagged scar on the earth, 3 miles east of the Miller Farm's main gate. It had been abandoned for decades, a place where teenagers went to drink and where the town's secrets went to be buried. Mark left his car a mile away, draped in a camouflage tarp he found in his father's garage, and moved through the woods on foot. His lungs burned, and every snap of a twig under his boots sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the night. He reached the ridge overlooking the quarry floor just as the first headlights appeared. 3 unmarked white box trucks rumbled down the steep gravel path, followed by Julian Miller's black SUV. Mark pulled out his phone, steadying his hands against a cold rock, and began to record. In the pale moonlight, he saw the back of the trucks open. Dozens of people, men, women, and even a few children, were ushered out by men carrying long, black flashlights and batons. They looked like ghosts, their faces pale and hollow, their movements sluggish with exhaustion and fear. Among them, he spotted the woman who had called a young girl with a bright red scarf he recognized from the farm's perimeter. She was arguing with Julian, pointing toward the trailers they had left behind. Julian didn't argue back. He backhanded her with such force that she collapsed into the gravel. Get them into the drainage tunnels. Julian's voice drifted up the ridge, amplified by the quarry's natural acoustics. The auditors won't go near the pits. Keep them there until the morning shift. If anyone makes a sound, Sheriff Vance handles the paperwork for trespassers. Mark zoomed in, capturing Julian's face clearly, then the terrified faces of the workers, and finally the license plates of the trucks. This was the burning building David had asked for. It was raw, undeniable evidence of human rights abuses and illegal detention. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the trees 20 feet to Mark's left. I told you he'd come here. Julian, a voice shouted. It was Bill Vance. The sheriff wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a tactical vest and carrying a shotgun. Sokol, stay where you are. You're trespassing on restricted industrial property. Mark didn't wait. He shoved the phone into his inner pocket and bolted into the thicket. He didn't head for his car. They would be waiting for him there. He ran toward the creek, the only part of the woods where the terrain was too steep for the SUV to follow. Bullets ripped through the canopy above him, the cracks echoing off the quarry walls. They weren't trying to arrest him. They were hunting him. He slid down a muddy embankment, his shoulder slamming into a tree trunk, and plunged into the icy, waist-deep water of the Oak Creek. He waited under the shadow of a fallen willow tree, pressing his back against the freezing mud, holding his breath as the beams of flashlights danced across the surface of the water just inches from his face. Find him. Vance roared from the bank. He's got a phone. If that footage leaves this county, we're all done. Search every inch of the bank. Mark stayed submerged until his skin went numb and his heart felt like it was stuttering. He realized then that he couldn't go back to his father's house. He couldn't go to the police. He was an outlaw in his own home, carrying a digital bomb that could level the town if he could only find a way to detonate it before they found him. The freezing water of Oak Creek felt like 1,000 needles piercing Mark's skin as he climbed out of the mud 3 miles downstream from the quarry. He was shivering violently, his breath coming in ragged, white plumes. His phone, the only thing that mattered now, was sealed in a waterproof baggie he'd had the foresight to bring. But its battery was draining fast in the cold. He couldn't go to the police, and he couldn't go to a hotel. Every public space in this county was an extension of the Miller family's eyes and ears. He moved through the back alleys of the town, a shadow among shadows. He needed his car keys and his father's old truck, but more importantly, he needed to see if Elias was still alive. The threat Julian had made about the oxygen tanks echoed in his mind with every heartbeat dot as he approached his father's house from the wooded lot behind the property. He saw the flickering blue lights of a cruiser parked in the driveway. It wasn't Vance. It was Deputy Miller, the mayor's nephew. The young man was sitting on the porch, casually swinging his legs, a shotgun resting across his knees. He was eating an apple, the crunching sound audible even from 30 yards away. Mark circled to the cellar door. He knew the hinges were rusted, but he also knew that if he lifted the door just right, it wouldn't moan. He slipped into the darkness of the basement, the smell of coal dust and old wood greeting him like a childhood memory that had turned sour. Above him, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the floorboards. Someone was searching the house. "He's not here, Sheriff," a voice called out. It was Sarah Jenkins. Mark froze. Sarah, the woman who had given him the ledger, was upstairs with Vance. "He'll come back for the old man." Vance's voice growled. "Sokol is sentimental. That's his weakness. Sarah, you did the right thing calling us. If he'd gone to the feds with that ledger you accidentally left out, this whole town would have burned. You're protecting your neighbors. Remember that." "I just want it to be over," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "Just don't hurt Elias. He doesn't know anything." Mark felt a wave of nausea. The one person he thought wasn't a lie had been the one to spring the trap at the quarry. There was no accidental ledger. It was a lure to see how much he knew. He realized then that the corruption wasn't just a top-down command. It was a collective agreement. The town wasn't being held hostage. It was an active participant in its own moral decay. He waited until the footsteps moved to the front of the house. Crawling through the crawl space, he reached the vent that led to his father's bedroom. He could hear the hiss of the oxygen concentrator. "Dad," he whispered through the grate. The wheezing stopped. A moment later, Elias's pale, weathered face appeared near the floor. His eyes were wide with terror. "Mark, you have to run," the old man hissed. "They took your keys. They're waiting for you to move. They told me if I didn't help them find you, they'd cut the power to the house. The storm is coming. Mark, the backup generator won't last an hour. I have the evidence. Dad, I'm going to the library. It's the only place with a dedicated T1 line that doesn't route through the sheriff's server. I'm going to upload it to every major news outlet in the state. They'll kill you before you hit send." Elias whispered, a single tear tracking through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. "But you were always a stubborn boy. Take the keys to the old mower shed. Under the loose brick, there's a motorcycle I never told your mother about. It's old, but it's fast. Go. Don't look back." Mark pressed his hand against the grate, a silent goodbye to the man he had come home to save, only to realize he could only save his father by destroying the town he lived in. The Oak Creek Public Library was a red brick building that Mark's own grandfather had helped lay the foundations for. Tonight, it stood as a dark monolith against the driving rain. The power in the town was flickering. The storm was tearing down lines. Or perhaps the Millers were cutting them systematically to isolate him. Mark arrived on the old 1970s Norton motorcycle, the engine a low throb that he'd cut a block away to maintain the element of surprise. He didn't use the front door. He used the coal chute in the back, a tight squeeze that left his clothes torn and his skin bruised. Inside, the library was a labyrinth of shadows. The smell of old paper and floor wax was suffocating. He made his way to the computer lab in the basement. He didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he used the glow of his phone to find the main terminal. The boot-up sequence of the old desktop felt like it took an eternity. Each beep and hum of the cooling fan sounded like a siren in the stillness. 30%, 50%, 80%. Finally, the desktop appeared. Mark fumbled with the USB cable connecting his phone. He began the upload to the state attorney's whistleblower portal and a high-profile investigative journalist in the city. File size 1.2 gigabytes. Estimated time 14 minutes. 14 minutes. In a town where everyone knew everyone, he might as well have been standing in the middle of the street with a megaphone. He sat in the dark, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. 2 minutes passed. Suddenly, the library's exterior floodlights snapped on, bathing the basement windows in a harsh, artificial glare. The sound of tires crunching on gravel followed. 2, 3. For vehicles. Mark Sokol. Julian Miller's voice came through a bullhorn, distorted and booming. "We know you're in there. We tracked the MAC address of that terminal the second you logged in. You're committing a federal crime by accessing encrypted municipal data. Come out now, and we can talk about a settlement. Think about your father. Mark, the storm just took out the power on your street. The hospital is 20 miles away, and the roads are blocked." Mark's heart hammered. They were playing their final card. If he stayed to finish the upload, his father might die in the dark. If he left, the truth died with him, and Tomas and dozens of others would disappear into the quarry's drainage tunnels forever. 60% uploaded. "Mark, 5 minutes," Julian shouted. After that, Sheriff Vance enters the building with authorization to use lethal force against an armed trespasser. "You don't want this, Mark. You're a lawyer, not a martyr." Mark looked at the screen. 75%. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. He wasn't going to fight them with a blade, but he had another plan. He began to unscrew the casing of the computer's hard drive while the upload continued. If he couldn't stay to see it finish, he would take the physical drive and run. But then, he heard the sound of the front doors being kicked in. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the floorboards above him. They weren't waiting 5 minutes. Mark grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and moved toward the server rack. He needed to buy 30 more seconds. He smashed the glass of the fire alarm, triggering a deafening, strobe-lit cacophony that filled the library. In the confusion of the sirens and the flashing lights, he dove under a heavy oak table, and just as the basement door was kicked open, flashlight, left corner, Vance's voice barked. The beam of a high-powered light swept over the desk where Mark had been sitting. The computer was still humming, the progress bar at 92%. "There. He's uploading something," one of the deputies shouted as the deputy rushed toward the terminal to pull the plug. Mark swung the fire extinguisher with every ounce of desperation he had left. It connected with the deputy's knees, sending him crashing into the desk. Mark didn't stop to look. He lunged for the mouse, his finger hovering over the final confirm button as a second shadow appeared in the doorway, the silhouette of a shotgun leveling at his chest. The concussive roar of the shotgun blast within the confined, low-ceilinged basement of the library was deafening. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that slapped the air out of the room. Mark felt the heat of the lead shot as it tore through the oak bookshelf inches from his head, sending a spray of pulverized paper and century-old dust into the air like a localized blizzard. The fire alarm, triggered by the shattered glass earlier, continued its rhythmic, agonizing scream, and the strobe lights turned the scene into a series of jagged, disconnected snapshots of violence. "Freeze, you son of a bitch." Vance's voice was a primal growl, barely audible over the mechanical shriek of the alarm. Mark didn't freeze. He scrambled on his knees toward the terminal. His ribs screamed where the deputy had kicked him, a hot, stabbing pain that suggested at least 2 were broken. His eyes were locked on the monitor, which was flickering under the strain of the library's dying power grid. 98%. 99%. A second deputy lunged from the shadows, his hands reaching for the Ethernet cable connected to the wall. Mark didn't have a weapon, but he had momentum. He threw the heavy fire extinguisher with a desperate, 2-handed heave. It struck the deputy's shoulder with a sickening thud, knocking the man into the server rack. Sparks showered the floor as the equipment tilted. Upload complete. Notification sent. "It's done, Bill," Mark shouted, his voice raw. He rolled onto his back as the sheriff's heavy boots slammed into his chest, pinning him against the cold concrete floor. the cold steel of a service pistol pressed firmly against the soft skin under Mark's jaw. The Attorney General, the FBI, the Daily Chronicle, they all have it. The quarry, the trucks, Julian's face. You can't kill a ghost. And that data is everywhere now. Vance's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. In the pulsing light of the strobe, he looked less like a lawman and more like a cornered animal. You think you're a hero. Sokol. You think some suit in the city gives a damn about a few hundred drifters in a hole. All you've done is burn down the house you were born in. There won't be a job left in this county by morning. There won't be a future. Then we'll build a new one. Mark wheezed, tasting copper in his mouth. One that isn't paved with bodies. Vance pulled back the hammer of the pistol. The click was the loudest thing in the room. But before he could pull the trigger, the basement's high, narrow windows were suddenly flooded with a brilliant, blue and red light. The ground began to vibrate with the deep, rhythmic thrum of a low-flying helicopter. A voice, amplified by a powerful PA system, boomed from outside, shaking the very foundations of the library. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All personnel inside the building, drop your weapons and identify yourselves immediately. The perimeter is secure. Vance froze. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by the hollow, gray look of a man who realized the walls of his kingdom had finally crumbled. He looked at the door, then back at Mark, his finger trembling on the trigger. Julian's gone, Bill. Mark whispered. He was never going to stay and fight with you. He's probably halfway to the border by now. Don't die for a man who wouldn't even buy you a drink. Vance let out a shaky, jagged breath and slowly lowered the gun. He didn't look at Mark again. He looked at the terminal, the small, glowing screen that had ended a 20-year empire of silence. Outside, the sound of flashbangs and the shouting of tactical teams signaled the end of the quiet haven. But as Mark lay there, his mind drifted away from the library and toward the darkened house on the edge of town, where a machine was failing to provide the one thing his father needed to live: breath. The autumn fog hung low over the Oak Creek Cemetery 3 months later, a thick, white shroud that made the world feel small and claustrophobic. Mark stood alone by the fresh headstone of Elias Sokol. The funeral had been small, painfully so. In a town of 4,000, only 5 people had shown up to pay their respects to a man who had lived there for 65 years. Elias hadn't died from the darkness. The federal teams had reached the house with a backup generator just in time. No, Elias had died 2 weeks later in a hospital bed, his spirit simply giving up once the war was over. He had looked at his son with a mixture of pride and profound sadness, a man who knew he was leaving behind a world that no longer had a place for him. Mark adjusted his coat against the biting wind. He looked like a shadow of the man who had arrived in town months ago. He was thinner, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before, and he walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the library basement. The fall out of the Quiet Haven case had been catastrophic. The Miller farm was a crime scene, its assets frozen by the federal government. Julian Miller had been caught at a private airfield in Pennsylvania. Sheriff Vance was awaiting trial in a federal facility, facing charges that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But the justice came at a staggering price. With the farm closed, the economic heart of Oak Creek had stopped beating. The local diner was boarded up. The hardware store was holding a going-out-of-business sale. The silence in the streets wasn't the peaceful quiet of a small town anymore. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of a vacuum. "I figured I'd find you here," a voice said behind him. Mark turned to see Sarah Jenkins. She was carrying a cardboard box filled with her personal belongings from the registrar's office. She had been fired, not for her involvement, but because the county simply couldn't afford to pay her salary anymore. "I'm leaving tonight, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of its former warmth. "Moving to my sister's in Ohio. There's nothing left here. Even the grocery store is cutting its hours. I did what had to be done, Sarah," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Did you?" Sarah looked at the rows of graves, her eyes cold. "You saved the workers, Mark, and you were right to do it. Those people deserved better. But you didn't just arrest the Millers? You killed the town. People are losing their homes. Families who had nothing to do with Julian's schemes are packing their cars and driving into the unknown because they can't buy milk for their kids. They don't see a hero when they look at you, Mark. They see the man who pulled the plug on their lives. The system was built on blood. Sarah, it couldn't last. Maybe, but we had to live in it, she replied. She didn't say goodbye. She just turned and walked toward her car, her footsteps echoing in the damp air. Mark stood there for a long time after she left. He thought about Tomas, who was now in a witness protection program, starting a new life under a different name. He thought about the millions of dollars in stolen subsidies that were being recovered by the state. It was a victory for the law. It was a victory for the truth. But, as he looked at the boarded-up windows of the town in the distance, it felt like a Pyrrhic one. He walked to his sedan, which was still parked by the cemetery gates. He had packed everything he owned into the trunk. He had no reason to stay. He was a ghost in his own home, a reminder of a truth the town wished had stayed buried in the North Acreage. As he drove past the Quiet Haven sign at the edge of town, he saw that someone had spray-painted the word Judas across the fading wood in jagged, black letters. He didn't stop to clean it. He didn't even slow down. He drove until the valley was nothing more than a gray smudge in his rearview mirror. The road ahead was open, leading back to the city, back to the life he had fought to build. But as the miles clicked by, Mark realized he was carrying the silence of Oak Creek with him. He had found the truth, but in doing so, he had learned the most bitter lesson of all, that sometimes the cost of justice is the very thing you were trying to save. He hit the highway, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, illuminating a path forward that felt both liberating and utterly, devastatingly lonely.